Welcome to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. Each week, we interview top experts in physical therapy, pain science, and integrative pain care. You'll learn the most up-to-date information for treating and reversing persistent pain. This podcast is for educational purposes only and not intended to be used as personalized medical advice. And now, here's your host, Dr. Joe Tatta.
Hey there, friend. Thanks for joining me this week and welcome back to the Healing Pain Podcast. On today's episode, we're discussing embodied cognition and the role of bodily processes in thought. In the field of pain care, we strongly lean on theories of how the brain works and how we can use the nervous system to modulate pain. Many of these theories are rooted in the idea that the brain is the seat of cognition and view the brain as a CEO which controls both thinking as well as our body. However, newer theories, such as embodied cognition, take a different perspective which emphasize the significance of the physical body in our cognitive abilities. Embodied cognition is a theory which draws on the work from the fields of psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, physiology, and even artificial intelligence. This new research points towards bodily processes, informing how our cognition is generated. Today, we're joined by Professor Rebecca Fincher-Kiefer, who is a professor of psychology at Gettysburg College, who will discuss the potential application of embodied cognition. Her research interests include the investigation of embodied cognition and how all that we know and understand is grounded in our bodies. She's on the cutting edge of this field of study, which includes the publication of a textbook called How the Body Shapes Knowledge: Empirical Support for Embodied Cognition. On today's episode, you'll learn all about embodied cognition and its potential influence on pain, health, and human behavior. Okay, without further ado, let's learn about embodied cognition and meet Professor Rebecca Fincher-Kiefer. Hi there, Rebecca. Welcome to this week's episode of the Healing Pain Podcast. We're excited you're here.
Hi, Joe. Thank you for having me.
This topic of embodiment, which is what we're going to focus on, and the body's role in thought, we've kind of danced around it on this podcast around, it's been almost 4 years since I've been doing this, but we've never taken a deep dive into embodied cognition, which I know you're somewhat of an expert in. You've written a textbook on it. And I want to point people to that textbook now. It's called How the Body Shapes Knowledge: Empirical Support for Embodied Cognition. And you can find that on Amazon or APA website. It's a wonderful book on embodied cognition that if you're a researcher or a clinician, it's a great read. It's a deep dive into embodied cognition. I know you're going to help us make some connections today with regard to our health, our well-being, chronic pain. But tell me how you became interested in the topic of embodied cognition, because it's rather new still as far as theories and research is considered.
Right. Thank you, Joe. You're right that as far as theoretical work goes, it takes a long, long time for a theory to be developed. And it takes even longer for that theory and that experimental work to make it into applied settings. So I would say while people have been talking about embodiment from philosophical perspectives and in cognitive science and even in computational work, it is a theory that in experimental cognitive psychology, it's quite new, and it's been tested for a good 20 years. But again, that feels kind of new to some of us. So I got interested because my previous research in reading comprehension was suggesting interesting aspects of kind of perceptual experiences that one might have when they were reading. And that, immediately means that your perceptual experiences give rise to certain thoughts and actually might inform those thoughts. And that's part of the essence of embodiment and embodied cognition, in that your body informs thought. And so just around that time in the 90s and the early 2000s, I was looking at that body of literature and that research in order to teach an advanced laboratory course in cognition. And I had typically taught about other topics, for example, comprehension and different types of memory. And embodiment really struck me as something that would be fascinating to students, and it has proven to be so.
So what we're reading can impact what we're perceiving.
Right. I think I would take it one slightly different way, and that is what we're reading gives rise to thoughts, and those thoughts have been informed by our body. And therefore, those thoughts also give rise to bodily reactions. So what we're reading, our ability to understand what we're reading probably comes from our physical and sensory experiences that we've had developmentally, and it actually even goes back further than that. Our kind of survival and evolutionary perspective on this theory is very strong, but what we're reading is understood because of our experiences.
So again, let's start. I mean, we're going to, like I said, we're going to go into some details here, but just the term embodied cognition can be a lot for people to chew on. What is a definition that you might use or explain to people what embodied cognition is?
So I agree. I think it's a pretty confusing little mini phrase there, a combination of two words, because it can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. And different disciplines have used this phrase in very different ways. So for an experimental cognitive psychologist who's trying to understand how we learn, how we remember, how we process information, all of those cognitive processes, the theory of embodied cognition is a theory that suggests that all of our knowledge is shaped by and actually comes about because of bodily experiences, sensory and physical experiences. So those physical and sensory experiences build our mental representations of thought. And that just everything I said was a lot to chew on too. And by this time, students are rolling their eyes and going, what the is she talking about? But if I may, I can give a quick example that I think is, it's a little sexy example, but it does help sometimes concretize this pretty abstract thought. So because, and this is one that's very well worn, so it's not even the best example of embodiment, but it's one that catches people and allows them sometimes to understand it, which is, you imagine just being born and trying in those initial moments, and the first experience you might have is being brought to your mother's chest or your father's chest and experiencing a very physical experience, a very bodily experience of warmth. So it's a temperature experience. And in fact, even babies that don't get that skin-to-skin contact right away are put in a warm situation. So as we begin our very long and arduous journey to build knowledge, one of the first things we've experienced is physicality. It's a temperature. And so the thought is that perhaps we understand a very abstract concept like love or attachment because of a physical experience that we have the moment we're born, like being touched and being warmed, that allows us to understand right away attachment, love. Now, that's the body informing thought. So there we go. We have an initial embodied cognition possibility. So for an experimental psychologist would say, well, that's interesting, but how do we test that? So in experimental psychology, we have hypotheses. The whole point of the science is to test those hypotheses. So we say, well, maybe it's true that we represent this abstract concept of love through warmth. How do we test it? Well, we can get some people to come into our laboratory and they hold a warm cup of coffee. And as they're holding that warm cup of coffee, we're asking them myriad questions, some very simple, what's your major, what, la, la, la. And one of the questions happens to be, rate on this scale how attached you feel to your family members or to your friends. It's been done a number of different ways. Tell me how close you feel to these individuals. And you compare that data, that rating data, to people who are holding a neutral temperatured cup of coffee. So you've got people holding a warm cup of coffee and people holding a neutral temperature. And you find that people experiencing warmth say that they feel closer to their family members. They feel more loved. They feel more affiliative than people holding the neutral cup. Now, one might immediately say, well, okay, that's just an association you have between warmth. That doesn't necessarily mean that, that physical temperature is constitutive of knowledge that we know for sure. So a good way to further test that is to say, well, we're going to put people in a room and we're going to ask some people in the same room to write a brief paragraph of a time when they felt particularly included, they felt loved, they felt supported, they felt close to their others. You get another group of people in that same room to write a paragraph about a time in which they felt excluded, they felt lonely, they felt not supported. And they finish that paragraph and you start then asking them a few questions. What do you think about this or that? Or, what's your major again? And one of those questions is, by the way, what do you think the temperature of this room is? The people who have written an essay, they've spent their knowledge, they've activated their knowledge of a time in which they felt included, judge the room to be warmer than the people that have thought about feeling excluded. So these kinds of pieces of converging evidence suggest that this abstract concept of love and attachment may be grounded in the physical experience of temperature.
So as you're speaking, it sounds to me embodied cognition is a more of a bottom-up approach to look at cognition. I'm curious if, from your perspective as an experimental psychologist, how would that be different from maybe other theories or branches of psychology? And is embodiment just a bottom-up approach, or is it also taking into consideration top-down theories?
That's a really excellent question. I would say, in the first brush, that embodiment sounds very much like a bottom-up, in the sense that knowledge starts with your body. And if that was a takeaway message, it's not a bad one. It's probably a pretty accurate one. The problem is that you get top down happening very, very quickly thereafter. So I want to say quickly that when cognitive psychology, when the discipline itself was first formed, it was built in the 50s and 60s by a number of other disciplines, by psychologists, but also by physiologists and by computer scientists and by philosophers. And especially because computer science was just coming to the fore at the same time as cognitive psychology, when cognitive psychologists were grappling with how do we think about the mental representation of knowledge, computer scientists were saying, yeah, figure that out, because we want to put it into a computer so that we can simulate human thought. And in doing that, they built all kinds of models of thought that had to do with what you would now call top-down, kind of a top-down approach, which means nodes that represent concepts. Okay, you've got fire. And how do we understand fire? And people would free associate to fire so that we could understand what do people think about when they think about fire. And you get red and you get truck and you get flames and you get all these other concepts. So those nodes were attached to other nodes, and the lengths of the paths between those nodes was very important, because it meant how quickly do you think from one concept to another. And models of mental representation of thought were built just based on everything I just said. And that's very top down, right? Because that's how do you think about other concepts with other concepts in mind. So it's very top down. But the problem with those models is that thought was never grounded in anything. That it was what Harned, as a philosopher, and Art Glenberg emphasized, is a symbol merry-go-round problem. One symbol is just connected to another symbol, but where is the referent? How do you think about that? And so when embodied cognition, Art Glenberg, Larry Barcelow, and some others who really built this theory said, we need to understand where knowledge comes from. It can't just be this symbol merry-go-round problem where you think of one concept because you've thought of another concept. What's the referent? What is it attached to? What is it grounded to? So that's where we get this idea where our knowledge must come from some place. And as Dennis Prophet likes to say, what would be the better vehicle than it's coming from our body? Where else can it come from? So you're right. It is a kind of bottom-up process in that way.
So that challenges a little bit of traditional cognitive theory, because they even teach a top-down model of thoughts lead to feelings, and then your feelings lead to a behavior, so to speak.
Yes.
And that's actually used in many traditional cognitive behavioral therapy approaches for chronic pain, for example, in lots of psychological approaches that are used throughout the world. However, this theory specifically of embodied cognition tells us that the sensations coming from your body through the various pathways, sight, hearing, touch, sound, interoception, which adds in a whole nother layer of senses, which a lot of people aren't even aware of. But
Right.
that is what informs what happens potentially cognitively, but it's happening so fast that you don't recognize a difference between the sensation coming in and being processed and the knowledge gathering and then the forming from it. Am I following you correctly?
Yes, yes, yes. Yes, and I see where you're coming from, and I think everything that you just said is accurate. It's a huge challenge to traditional cognitive theories of the mental representation of thought. Huge challenge in that from the 60s all the way to the early 2000s, again, late 90s, that's what everybody assumed what cognition was, how it was represented just in this. And it wasn't that those ideas or those theories, which were very, very detailed, hadn't been tested. They had been tested not only through computer science, robotics, linguists testing these theories. They were assumed to be true because that's how people think about thinking. I have this thought, and then I have this thought, and then I have this thought and this thought. So, it took a while for us to actually kind of point out or at least recognize the emptiness of that theory in some ways, which is, but where did those thoughts first come from? And once you really push that issue, then you understand how the body is essential to thought.
Mm-hmm. So as you're speaking, the two populations of people who I think this applies most toward, and I think it's exciting for them, and it's specifically exciting for the world of physical rehabilitation, because we've always said for people with chronic pain, you can't just apply a cognitive approach to this problem, that in some way we have to use the body, right? We still are not clear about exactly how to do that yet, but this theory starts to support that. The other population, I would say, are those struggling or living with PTSD.
Right.
And as I listen to you talk about this, it's almost like, why haven't we shared this more with obviously those two populations of people and the professionals that treat them? Because still to this day, there's, we live in a society where the brain is valued, and the brain is almost placed on a pedestal, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of what we do in this podcast is we talk about the brain and the nervous system.
Right.
But the more I've learned, and obviously, and from reading your book especially, and I really did read your entire, which is a textbook, there's a lot of detail in there. It really helped me with the idea that my brain actually extends from outside my skull throughout my entire body. So my brain is not this organ encased in our skull the way we think of it. My brain goes throughout my entire body. So instead of chunking it down into a peripheral nervous system, an essential nervous system, an enteric nervous system, I just start thinking of things now. I have a nervous system. And a big part of that nervous system is what's happening from below my chin, and that's informing how I perceive things in my life. So perception is a big part of this model as well, correct?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. I think some of the most interesting phenomena that are supported by this theory, or that can be explained by this theory, have to do with the perceptual phenomena that are very hard to deny, that your body is critical in our perception. So if perception is an interpretation of sensation, and again, sensory experiences are very physiological, they're very biological in nature. So, we have light information coming in and impinging upon our retina, and the cells that receive the information from our retina form our optic nerve, and la. And that's all very physiological, but it's the interpretation of that we call perception. And so how our body helps us perceive the world is clearly an area of embodied cognition, and Dennis Profit and his students and colleagues have a whole theory of embodied perception that's very specific. So embodied cognition being the more global kind of theory, and embodied perception being a path. But it clearly suggests that if you are fatigued, if you are burdened by a backpack, if you are depleted in your resources, if you are in pain, you perceive the world differently. Mm-hmm. And that's because, as Art Glenberg says, again, cognition serves action. So if our body is going to be informing our thought, then it would make sense for us to perceive the world differently if we are burdened. So burdened comes, that's a big term, right? But we can be burdened because we have a weight on our back, and therefore we're going to see a particular distance, as further away than people who don't have a burden on their back, because our body needs to capture that information and say, well, cognition is serving action. I can't act on that very readily, so I better see that distance is further away, because now I need to expend my energy in a different way.
So I'd like to build that out a little bit, because in your book, you provided an example of a patient with a walker, mm-hmm. which I think is just so impactful for physical therapists and others in rehab. But can you describe that in your book, that scenario of the patient with the walker, and how it impacts perception?
Well, we may be kind of misremembering a couple things. This research on pain, particularly in the slant and distance perception research, wasn't necessarily specific to having a walker. There is some really interesting research on children that have used walkers. That's again very empirical and very basic science that I'll mention very quickly, and that is part of this. Does movement actually develop thought? And that's research that shows young children who are given the opportunity to be in walkers pre their own personal locomotive activity. So they're not able to locomote on their own, but they're put in a walker and they can walk around and explore the world. Those children that have been given that experience show perceptual skills that children that don't have that experience don't show. So that's some really interesting information, again, about how action can actually build a perceptual skill. Mm-hmm. The other pain research that I think you're talking about is, again, in the area of how do we perceive distances. And it's consistent with the literature that I spoke of before, which is people that have their resources depleted, either because of pain, because of weight, because of gender. Women perceive distances differently than men. People with shorter legs perceive distance differently than people with long legs. So there are just a number of these examples of the fact that when it's almost an illusion, if you will, that when we perceive what Prophet calls an extent out away from us, it will be affected by our own bodily characteristics. So if we are in pain, we'll perceive that distance as further. And that can't be changed. And you can't try to talk somebody out of that. That's how you perceive the world, is that a slant is steeper and a distance is further if your body needs more energy to traverse it.
Right. Now, what you just said, so you said an illusion, mm-hmm. and there are some of the world's major pain researchers, who a lot of our listeners will know who they are, have theories that say pain is actually an illusion. And that's never stuck really well with me.
Oh, yeah.
I think a better way, or how we can potentially improve that, is to say that pain impacts our perception of our experience that's happening around us. Would that fit well with embodied cognition?
Oh my goodness, absolutely. And it's a much better and more accurate clarification. And I would never.
Because there's a TED talk there's a TED talk of a major researcher saying pain is an illusion. And I
Yeah.
was like, well, that's really tough if you're someone with chronic pain.
Sure.
And I think your research really informs it's not pain that's the illusion. The pain is there, but how the pain is that physical sensation you're experiencing in your body, how that impacts your perception of your experience is what's going on.
Yes, it's the cognition that's the illusion. It's not the physical experience at all. No. And I don't know that literature, and I don't even know that TED talk. But it's, again, in cognitive psychology, we talk about illusions, and many illusions are very functional. We have them because our brain is telling us something that's important for our world and our life and survival, right? So we needed to have a cognitive system that would say, if you are low on resources, you better not run up that hill, because that hill is steep and you need to conserve those resources. So see the hill as steeper, because then you will more appropriately use the resources that are available to you. That's the illusory part, and it's not really we need to be very careful with that term. Yeah. I probably used it too lightly.
The other aspect of embodied cognition, this takes us back, you mentioned this earlier in the interview today, an evolutionary perspective of how we evolved as humans. There's some theory and maybe some myth out there that as our brain grew, so to speak, that's how we evolved. Although some of this research points potentially toward, as we started to move in different ways, that's what allowed our brain to become bigger and evolve, so to speak. So without the movement aspect of it, we may not have the brains we have today, so to speak.
Right. Again, I think that's consistent in the sense that action is so important to cognition. And I think from the evolutionary perspective, there's some really interesting work and some interesting thoughts on how embodiment provides us with perhaps some insight into animal cognition. And then as we move up the hierarchy of species, that kind of progress and that development. And some of it is about scaffolding our knowledge. So we learn something because of movement, and then some species have the ability to develop language that continues to contribute to knowledge representations, because the language is a reflection of what we just learned through action. So lower species may not have that, as well as higher order species. So we say, she has such a warm personality, or he leaves me cold. And why do we use this terminology? Was it because grandma said it? It's just a colloquialism, or is it because language actually reflects thought? And embodiment says the metaphors that we use are very powerful because they actually give us a reflection of how we've understood that concept. So she's just a warm person. It's weird to give a temperature attribute to a personality, or temperature description to a personality. But it's because what we're trying to say is this person is loving. And I understand love because I understand the physicality of warmth. And warmth gave me that understanding. So, it might be that animals, and this is part of, how embodiment can kind of work downward in some way and explain some animal cognition. It may be that animal cognition has that base of embodiment in the absence of the scaffolding of language that we use to understand things too.
So you mentioned metaphor. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of study around metaphor in the chronic pain space. Some metaphor study exists in a approach called acceptance and commitment therapy, which uses metaphor. If a patient, so let's give a real life example to how metaphor and embodied cognition kind of intersect. If a patient, let's say, has knee pain and they go to their orthopedic surgeon, and the orthopedic surgeon takes an x-ray and then holds the x-ray up and says, you have very advanced arthritis in your knee. you have a lot of degeneration. There's a lot of wear and tear happening here, and it's bone on bone. So wear and tear, bone on bone, these are all metaphors that are used frequently in the physical medicine space, and they really should not be used that frequently. But how do you think of that as a scientist who studies embodied cognition?
Oh gosh, Joe, that might be a stretch for me, because there are a number of ways that I would address that question. One is that some of that is not metaphorical at all. So bone on bone means something very literal, right? And degeneration means something very literal. Now, my interpretation of that, if I were the patient, maybe degeneration is a pretty strong negative word and has negative connotations. Bone on bone just sounds bad, right? So the metaphor that I'm using now is an auditory description of something that's actually very physical. And there's some interesting things about that. But the metaphors that, and this I might be pushing it out a little bit too far, but let me go there and you can bring me back if I haven't helped you. The metaphors of saying things like you need to move forward. That metaphor, when you tell something you need to move forward from this, whether it's pain or a problem or whatever, you need to move forward. That's metaphoric. Why do we say that? Why do we say moving forward? Well, because again, in our evolutionary and developmental past, when we had to get something, we had to move forward. We had to literally, in our physical space, get something. We need to approach something. An approach movement is moving forward. And when you use that metaphor, it typically makes accessible knowledge about achieving things, being more motivated. It's a very positive metaphor. It's meant to be a positive metaphor. When we're stuck in something, when we're at a standstill, those are negative metaphors that in an embodied way represent you're not progressing, you're standing still. Mm-hmm. So if we try to push that into an applied world, which is difficult to do and needs to be tested, and I try not to go there too far since it's not my expertise, but when you try to push it into applied world, where that goes is, if you're going to do exercise, make sure you do exercise where you are moving forward, and I have my air quotes going, so that you're not just running in place, but maybe you're boxing and you are actually, you're doing something that is competitive, and you may be moving forward in your, I don't know, I'm not doing a great job of that example, but dancing or something where you are physically moving forward has been shown, there is some research that suggests this, to be a better form of exercise for people who feel stuck than doing something like a stationary bike or running in place, right? Go out and run outside. That you're literally moving forward, and that is action that informs thought that makes you feel better. So there's some evidence that in terms of mental health issues like depression, where you apply the actions that are consistent with the metaphors that, again, the language has been scaffolding the cognition about you are progressing because you are literally moving forward.
I like that. So you're scaffolding the language.
Yeah.
And it's demonstrating what action to take, basically.
Right, exactly.
Right.
That
it's almost in some ways it's almost I don't mean to simplify embodied cognition, because it's not necessarily simple, but in some ways it almost seems like a reverse of cognitive therapy to me, or cognitive theory, except obviously what's happening in our body is so vast. We haven't even really been able to, just the world of interoception, the theory of interoception hasn't even been fully developed for us to really understand what's happening there.
No, but man, is that just ripe for investigation.
Yeah, it
I have
really
some
is.
new studies on my desk that I hope to get to with even my students this semester in my course Embodied Cognition on interoception. And there's some new research that suggests that people who are more sensitive to interoceptive cues, they can do, for example, they can kind of count their own heartbeat. Now, this is not something that anybody can do easily, but some of it's a little deceptive. It's people that believe they can or that they are sensitive to their own heartbeat. Those people that are, again, particularly aware of bodily clues and cues tend to be more empathetic towards others.
Mhm.
It's also another path of embodiment, is that I understand you because I'm watching you act. And when I act that way, I feel this way.
Mhm.
So if I can understand your actions, then I can be empathetic towards you. I can understand you better because I'm watching you behave in a way. So if I understand my own internal signals, I might be particularly sensitive to somebody else's internal signals.
Mhm.
And that's an interesting aspect of the cognition of empathy.
Yeah, a lot of overlaps there with mindfulness type theories
Yes,
and approaches.
absolutely.
So, for example, um, if you're aware of a loving kindness meditation,
Mhm.
um, which has been known to increase things like empathy and compassion,
Right.
we still think of that as a very cognitive approach, actually, because you say like certain words
Mhm.
or phrases. May you be happy, may you be safe, for example, right?
Right.
So it's thinking and saying those things. But
Right.
from embodiment perspective, as I'm in that meditation, if I can also have an awareness of my heartbeat, and my heart is beating relatively steady,
Mhm.
and I identify a steady heartbeat as calm or peace,
Mhm.
then that's part of that entire experience. So that can really inform that entire perception or experience of what happens during that meditation. Conversely, if something the teacher says gives me anxiety and my heart starts beating faster, so to speak,
Right.
again, that's another example of how this could be applied potentially.
Right. Right. Absolutely. I think there is a interoception and proprioception, trying to understand these kinds of signals from our body is an interesting offshoot of the theory and can be wrapped up, quite nicely within it at times as well.
So I'm just curious. I mean, you're not a licensed clinical psychologist, but you do have a PhD in psychology. So you're interacting with a lot of psychologists. What advice would you give to a psychologist who's just using a pure cognitive approach to working with their clients with regard to embodied cognition?
Gosh, I don't, because I'm so far away from clinical psychology, I wouldn't want to pretend that I really know what a pure cognitive approach would look like. So I'd hate to, presume what a particular approach would suggest to patients with any kind of issues. Um, I think embodiment is going to eventually work its way, or at least embodied cognition as a theory will start to work its way into more clinical settings as the theory gets tested and retested and replicated, and we really see that there is a appropriate path to application.
Mhm.
I'm very hopeful for that. I think that there's a lot of interesting things, in terms of mindfulness, in terms of these things that we've talked about, in terms of exercise. The little bit of research that I've seen, even on, okay, let's take a facial posture thing, because again, there's been some interesting posture effects that are consistent with embodied cognition. So we know, for example, if you smile, even when you're non-aware, not consciously aware of the fact that you're smiling, if you smile, you're going to see things as more positive, you're going to feel more positive, etc. That's only interesting because the participant who's smiling doesn't know they're smiling, right? So it goes the other way around too. If you're frowning and you've got brow lines that are constantly in that frowning state, then you're going to feel more negative, and that body will inform your thought, and you may perseverate on that. Well, Botox injections have been shown to you relax those frown lines with Botox injections, and people then in the experimental literature, they have trouble actually comprehending negative sentences. So maybe this a little touch, I've read this just the beginning of this, that Botox may be a therapeutic solution to kind of perseverative, depressive thoughts. If you can get your facial posture out of that mode, it will inform your cognitions in a different way. So, those are the kinds of things that I've seen, but I don't know what a more traditional cognitive approach would be.
Or you can just do face yoga.
Yes,
because they have that now too.
Actually. Right. Yeah.
Rebecca, it's been great speaking with you. I know this is a really heady topic, but you've made it really simple for us, so we appreciate it.
I hope so.
Again, I want to point everyone to the book, How the Body Shapes Knowledge, Empirical Support for Embodied Cognition. And Rebecca, please let our listeners know how they can learn more about you and follow your work.
Oh, goodness. Thank you, Joe. And I would just do the same thing. I would point to the book. It is available on Amazon and through APA. It is a heady book. It's a book that is not easy to get through because it's really rich with empirical data that supports this theory. And that's what's so important for eventually getting the theory to move into applied settings that you and your listeners are interested in. So I hope it makes it there. I hope that's what the book does, is serve as a starting point for those kinds of conversations and research that supports them.
Well, we have lots of neuroscience geeks who listen to this podcast, so they'll definitely be checking it out on Amazon.
Yeah.
Again, I want to thank Rebecca for joining us. At the end of every podcast, I ask you to share this episode with your friends and family on your favorite social media platform, which is probably LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. If you're there, tag me at drjoetatta.com, and I'll make sure to tag you back. I'm Dr. Joe Tatta, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. To subscribe to the podcast and learn more, visit Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. That's Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. Sign up to receive weekly updates, leave a review on iTunes, and share this episode with your friends.